So we have a little bit of a problem here. We've learned three methods for solving a quadratic equation. We can solve it by factoring, thinking of it as a polynomial equation. We can solve it using the square root property, which might involve completing the square, or we can solve it using the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula will always get us to an answer. The quadratic formula will always get us to a solution. But if the numbers are nice, the quadratic formula is probably the most tedious way that we could solve our equation. So when we encounter a quadratic equation, how do we decide which method to use? Well, if our equation is already set up to make the square root property easy, we should use that. So that means what we're on the lookout for is there's no x term. Either there's only an x squared term, or we've already got x plus something or other squared. So there's no term with just x to the first power, only an x squared term, or something with an x in it squared. That's set up to make the square root property easy. If the square root property is easy, we should use it. If our equation is not set up to make the square root property easy, we should write our equation in standard form before we decide what to do next, because all the rest of this works on an equation in standard form. Once our equation is in standard form, we should look at it and see if factoring seems easy. When is factoring easy? Well, factoring is easy if the leading coefficient is 1, and then the other two numbers, b and c, are small integers. What integers count as small to you depends on kind of how much multiplication table you have memorized. If you can look at the number c and figure out what factors it has, then those are small integers. Factoring is also pretty easy if AC is small or has few factors. So I would say if like A is 2, factoring is probably still going to be easier than the quadratic formula. Now, of course, sometimes factoring just doesn't work. Right? You search through all of the factors of AC, and there's just no way to get your middle term. Or sometimes you try to factor and you just can't spot it. If factoring fails, but the numbers are really nice, it can be worth it to try completing the square. Right? If you're proficient in completing the square, it'll often be easier than the quadratic formula. It's easy when A is 1 and B is even, because then you won't get any fractions showing up when you complete the square. If you're comfortable with fractions, completing the square is pretty easy whenever A, B, and C are small integers. Fractions show up when you complete the square, but on the other hand, you end up with a less complicated square root to simplify most of the time. So try factoring if it seems easy. If factoring seems hard, or else if factoring fails and completing the square seems hard, that's when you should use the quadratic formula. If the numbers are ugly, go straight to the quadratic formula. If the numbers are nice, so if they're small integers, try to factor, try completing the square.